For decades, the world viewed the American middle class as an unshakable fortress, the ultimate image of stability, security, and prosperity. But while the public image continued to shine in billboards, speeches, and postcards, something silent began to form behind the scenes. It didn't emerge from a major crisis, nor from a sudden collapse. It was born from the accumulation of small, almost invisible fractures that began to spread across the country like cracks under a floor too polished to be. Truce. Over the past 2 decades, millions of workers have discovered an uncomfortable reality. What was promised to them no longer exists. The path to social advancement, once clear and predictable, has become dependent on relentlessly accumulating debt, workdays that exceed human limits, and a cost of living that rises like an unstoppable tide. America remains illuminated by its shop windows and skyscrapers, but behind that light are families counting pennies, adults forced to postpone dreams, young people giving up on plans, and a growing sense that stability has become a rare privilege. The signs of this silent collapse are already everywhere: whispered conversations about layoffs, supermarkets where shopping carts are getting lighter and lighter, once prosperous neighborhoods devoured by debt and exhaustion. Yet many insist on treating them as exceptions, failing to realize that they are symptoms of something much larger, something that has been in motion for years. Because the true cause of this process is not where everyone points to. It operates in the shadows methodically, continuously, and almost invisibly. And it is precisely this hidden mechanism that this documentary will expose starting in the next minute. Before we move on to the next revelation, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This ensures you follow each step of this investigation and helps us keep this work going. Let's continue. As daily life in America unfolds against a seemingly stable urban landscape, what lies behind the scenes is a reality profoundly different from that projected in official speeches. The cost of living is rising at a rate that surpasses any wage adjustment, pushing entire families into a routine of continuous and silent sacrifices. In neighborhoods that once represented security and predictability, there are increasing reports of people who need to hold down 2 or 3 jobs to cover expenses that, just a few years ago, would have been easily manageable with a single source of income. The disparity between what is earned and what is paid has become a chasm that grows day by day, creating a kind of normalization of the crisis, where survival has become a skill, not a consequence of work. This instability is visibly manifested in the streets. Markets are always full, but shopping carts are increasingly empty. Gas stations reflect at the pump the distortions of an economic model that depends on consumption, but simultaneously destroys the purchasing power of those who maintain that consumption. Small towns that once prospered with local commerce face a slow erosion, with closed doors, for sale signs, and empty buildings that echo the absence of opportunities. In large metropolises, inequality is brutally evident. While some neighborhoods boast modernity and luxury, others experience the progressive degradation of public services, such as health and education, which can no longer meet minimum demands. Emotional pressure also becomes noticeable in casual conversations, where expressions like, "It's not easy," "I don't know how long this will last," and "everything is too expensive," cease to function as sporadic outbursts and become constant declarations of collective exhaustion. Financial insecurity enters homes like a permanent visitor, altering routines, family decisions, and future expectations. The feeling that the system doesn't give back what it demands grows proportionally to the exhaustion of those who try every day to avoid accumulating debts that are formed not out of irresponsibility, but out of survival. This set of scattered and silent signs makes up a picture that many insist on calling temporary difficulties. However, when observed together, they reveal a pattern that indicates that something much larger, deeper, and more structured is operating behind this seemingly spontaneous deterioration, something that cannot be explained solely by the visible economic surface. And it is precisely at the point where these clues begin to converge that the question arises that almost no one dares to ask. To understand why the American middle class faces such fragility, it is necessary to look beyond the visible events that usually occupy headlines. The current deterioration did not stem from a sudden crisis, but from a structure carefully built over decades in which political decisions and financial mechanisms converged to transform indebtedness into a central part of economic functioning. At first glance, the expansion of credit seemed to offer freedom, access to housing, education, and consumption. But in practice, it has consolidated itself as a system that traps millions in endless payment cycles, where any small advance is absorbed by interest that grows faster than wages. This model gained strength when financial institutions realized that the stable income of the middle class was ideal ground for selling credit products presented as life easers. Credit cards, student loans, and long-term mortgages ceased to be optional tools and became pillars of daily life. Thus, an economy was created that encourages continuous consumption and, at the same time, punishes those who try to reduce spending, as if stability depended on keeping everyone permanently indebted. Politics played a key role in this process. Legal reforms broadened the reach of banks, while corporate influence shaped decisions that prioritized conglomerates and shifted risks to workers. In this cycle, the more people owe, the more the system grows, and the more it grows, the more people owe, which raises an inevitable question. Who really wins when an entire nation lives in debt? As debt ceases to be an occasional resource and begins to operate as a structural axis of American life, its consequences stop appearing as economic fluctuations and reveal themselves as a continuous process of deterioration that cuts across cities, families, and generations. The impact manifests itself first in urban spaces, regions that for decades sustained industries, local commerce, and family neighborhoods begin to register population decline, unaffordable prices, and the loss of jobs that once kept the economy going. The closure of small businesses symbolizes more than financial bankruptcy. It marks the dismantling of entire community networks. With fewer residents and lower tax revenue, public services are gradually collapsing. Schools are reducing class sizes. Hospitals are operating with minimal staff, and basic infrastructure is suffering constant cuts. In rural areas, the migration of young people is creating nearly deserted zones. In large cities, the distance between wealthy and neglected neighborhoods is becoming a visible boundary, exacerbating inequalities. At the same time, financial instability begins to shape intimate decisions. Weddings are postponed, buying a home becomes a distant dream, and raising children faces limitations imposed by uncontrollably rising costs. The future ceases to be planned and becomes managed, a continuous attempt to avoid further harm. And, given this scenario, the question arises that few dare to face. What happens to a society when the economic structure that sustained it begins to crumble from within? While economic indicators reveal an undeniable material decline, an even deeper transformation is silently taking hold within American society. Daily life is becoming a succession of routines marked by emotional exhaustion, the result of a lifestyle that demands ever more energy, time, and availability, but returns less and less sense of purpose. In large cities, the constant presence of technology and the proliferation of automated services create the illusion of practicality, while simultaneously dissolving the human interactions that once sustained a sense of community. Modern life, replete with conveniences, paradoxically amplifies isolation, turning people into solitary inhabitants of spaces full of light. Yet, devoid of connection, the progressive shrinking of the middle class is manifested not only in the loss of purchasing power, but also in the erosion of a collective identity that for decades represented stability, belonging, and a vision for the future. The constant pressure to maintain standards that are no longer financially possible creates a permanent feeling of inadequacy, leading many to see themselves as responsible for a crisis that, in reality, stems from factors far greater than their personal choices. This feeling of silent failure spreads among workers who, despite their intense dedication, no longer achieve the traditional milestones of adulthood, such as home ownership, a secure retirement, or emotional comfort. This void, emotional, social, and identity-related, functions as a kind of internal collapse that progresses parallel to economic problems. It redefines expectations, erodes confidence in the future, and transforms progress into a kind of mirage that demands constant sacrifices without offering proportional returns. As this feeling intensifies, so does the perception that the country, despite its material abundance, has never been so far from guaranteeing real well-being for the majority of its population. And when loneliness and emotional exhaustion combine with economic fragility, the result is a transformation that turns the decline into something even deeper, a collapse that can be measured not only in numbers, but in people's behavior itself. But it is precisely in the numbers that the truth becomes impossible to ignore. When the emotional reality of a population begins to deteriorate, it is common for many to try to justify this feeling by resorting to the belief that it is all just perception, that modern life has only created an exaggerated impression of instability. However, one only needs to look at the numbers to realize that what is happening in the United States is not psychological, not a collective impression, nor a phase of economic adaptation. It is a measurable, documented, and widely recorded process, although rarely exposed with the necessary depth. The data reveal a picture that challenges any optimistic narrative. The world's largest economy is experiencing levels of fragility reminiscent of historical periods of collapse. Currently, more than 60% of Americans say they cannot cope with a basic financial emergency without resorting to immediate credit. This statistically consolidated inability indicates not only a lack of preparedness, but above all a complete erosion of the ability to retain income. At the same time, the volume of student debt exceeds unimaginable figures, creating entire generations that begin adult life owing amounts greater than many will be able to repay over decades. Medical debt, an element practically non-existent in other developed nations, reaches numbers that transform healthcare into a privilege and not a right. Food bank dependency rates have already surpassed those of critical periods like the Great Depression, demonstrating that these are not isolated cases, but a structural phenomenon affecting millions, regardless of education level or individual effort. Many small towns are experiencing significant drops in revenue, resulting in school closures, reduced services, and deteriorating infrastructure. Statistics also reveal that a large portion of middle-class families live in a permanent state of postponement, constantly reorganizing priorities to avoid defaulting on payments, while simultaneously facing persistent inflation in essential items such as rent, transportation, and food. These data, when viewed together, form a clear map of the economic deterioration spreading across the country, indicating that the problem is broad, deep, and systematically ignored. With each new report releasing even more alarming figures, it becomes evident that collapse is not something that can be prevented with optimism or individual financial discipline, but rather the result of a model that has already exceeded its equilibrium point. If the numbers already point to such an unstable future, what can we expect when the impact of these statistics begins to be irreversibly reflected in the functioning of society? When numbers cease to be exceptions and become a national pattern, they become unmistakable signs that the country is advancing towards a more severe stage than any conventional economic crisis. What is observed is no longer the typical market fluctuations, but rather the formation of a structural fragility that compromises the social foundations upon which the nation built its identity. The rupture of the middle class, previously seen as a remote possibility, now presents itself as a measurable and progressive reality, creating an environment where inequality is not only a consequence, but a constant operating mechanism. As the distance between the extremes widens, the stability that sustained the country for so many decades unravels. With increasing speed, this imbalance directly affects the legitimacy of institutions that previously represented security. Trust in public policies diminishes as the population perceives that assistance programs, far from solving the problem, only delay the impact of the decline. Simultaneously, the number of people who depend exclusively on credit to meet basic needs grows, amplifying a sense of vulnerability that permeates all layers of society. The political environment becomes more polarized, not due to profound ideological differences, but due to the shared fear that the system no longer offers the minimum guarantees of social stability. Fragmentation intensifies when entire neighborhoods begin to coexist with a combination of economic insecurity and loss of prospects. In some regions, structural unemployment reduces the circulation of capital and causes population exodus that transforms entire communities into partially abandoned territories. In others, the hyper-concentration of wealth creates isolated enclaves that seem to exist on the margins of the reality surrounding the rest of the population. This division, sustained by economic interests and policies that prioritize maintaining a debt-based economy, projects a future where social imbalance will not be the exception, but the rule. As these elements converge, it becomes impossible to ignore that the country is approaching a tipping point where small deteriorations transform into broader collapses, irreversibly altering the social dynamic. And this inevitably leads to the most uncomfortable question of all: what remains of a nation when its socioeconomic base ceases to exist? When a society goes through a prolonged period of economic instability, it is common to look for specific explanations, such as poorly implemented policies or inevitable external crises. However, what is observed in the United States today cannot be reduced to a single mistake or a succession of governmental errors. What is underway is a broad, deep, and cumulative phenomenon in which decades of decisions driven by financial interests have slowly eroded the structure that sustained the middle class. This progressive erosion does not manifest itself suddenly, but through numerous signs that, when viewed in isolation, seem disconnected, although together they compose a clear picture of systemic decline. The feeling of loss is not limited to the economic field, but extends to emotional and social layers that define the collective experience. A kind of silence settles among people, not caused by a lack of information, but by an excess of uncertainties that make it difficult to project a minimally stable future. The promise of social mobility, which for so long nourished generations, has weakened in the face of a reality where individual effort no longer guarantees the results that were once considered achievable. This perception spreads rapidly, especially among young people, who, upon entering the job market, discover that opportunities that were once abundant have now become fragmented and highly competitive. This shift in perception creates a kind of symbolic rupture in which the American dream ceases to operate as a collective ideal and begins to exist only as a cultural memory. The transition from a society based on the expectation of growth to one centered on the constant management of risks reveals a historical inflection point. It is precisely at this point that it becomes evident that collapse does not happen the moment a country falls, but when its population ceases to believe that it is possible to recover. This silent disenchantment spreads slowly, becoming as dangerous as any economic statistic, because it dismantles the social bonds that keep hope alive. Given this scenario, the disappearance of the middle class ceases to be merely an economic phenomenon and becomes an emotional landmark that redefines the country. It marks a symbolic boundary between what the United States was and what it is inevitably becoming. Understanding this transition is not just about analyzing numbers, but recognizing that a structural change is underway, transforming how millions live, work, and dream. If this documentary opened your eyes to something that never makes the headlines, subscribe now. Every day, new silent truths are emerging, and you deserve to see each one before they disappear again.